Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Recently, for reasons I don't really remember, I was looking up dresses for a garden party. And one of the pictures that came up was this, I believe it's vintage Barbie dress. And I really liked the style of this dress and had a scrap of fabric that I thought would be perfect for recreating a similar look for my dolls. I started by cutting out the bodice pieces from this pastel floral fabric. So that's one front bodice piece cut on the fold, two back bodice pieces, and two sleeves. I also marked the darts on the front and back pieces. Now this pattern came from a basic pattern set that is intended for pattern drafting. I will link it in the description. I got this not only for the ability to be able to draft patterns and get different looks, but also because I really want to get to where I can make Barbie dresses that don't look like a doll dress, but look more like I took a regular size dress and shrunk it. And this pattern is great for that because it really does look a lot like the basic bodice patterns that I use when making my own clothes, just, smaller. I wanted a square neckline, so after I cut out the front bodice piece, I folded it in half and placed it on top of a doll. I then used that doll to determine how far down I could go with the neckline and cut from the center front in and then up into the shoulder seam. I probably could have cut this bigger, but I was pretty careful how much I cut away because I knew I would lose some of the fabric to the seam allowance. I started assembling by sewing the darts on all of the bodice pieces, so that's 2 for the front and 1 for each of the back pieces. I then sewed these pieces together at the shoulder seams. To finish the neckline, I placed the bodice right side down onto a scrap of voile and stitched around it. Then I trimmed the voile away and clipped the corners and flipped it into the inside of the bodice, then whip stitched it into place. For the sleeves, I started by hemming them. This pattern has a very narrow seam allowance and insetting sleeves on the scale is just hard in general. So I hand basted them in place first before going back and sewing the seams again on the machine. Next, sew the side seams, and then it's ready to be tried on the doll so that I can determine how far to turn under the center back seam. Because of the narrow seam allowances, I have found that it's better to actually cut that center back seam a little wider, and then when everything else is assembled, to just try it on the doll and determine how far that needs to be turned under. This just gives a little more room for error in how I sew those seams. Now for the skirt. The center of the original is white with layers of what looks like gathered lace. And because of how thick that can be already, I didn't want to have to gather this panel even more on top of that. So I drafted a skirt panel that turned out to be about 1/8 of a circle. I kind of followed the method for my circle skirt tutorial, but not as precise. I kind of just kept drawing lines for the waist until I got one that was about the size I wanted, and then just added the appropriate length to the bottom of that. And I used this pattern to cut out a piece of white broadcloth, which I then hemmed and began adding layers of lace onto that panel, starting at the bottom and working my way up. Once it was completely covered, I trimmed off the excess. Once it was completely covered, I trimmed off the excess lace. For the rest of the skirt, I took a rectangle of floral fabric the same length as the panel, cut it in half. For each panel, I hemmed the bottom as well as the top half of one side edge. Then Then I attached each of these rectangles onto either side of the center panel, folded the side panels toward the center of the skirt so that they almost formed a pleat over that white section. Then I pinned the skirt to the bodice and gathered it by hand. Sewed that seam on the machine and actually had to re-sew it because I didn't catch all of the layers the first time. I don't think these gathers ended up looking too good, and I kind of think maybe I should have used pleats instead. But to cover up the terrible gathering, I added a couple pieces of ribbon, starting at the center back of the waist, and then coming up so that they met at the front, where I tied them into a bow. Then I attached Velcro to the back opening and sewed the remainder of the back skirt seam. Time to try it on. The dress is lovely by itself, but the look wouldn't be complete without a hat. So I crocheted one and added a pink ribbon around the brim. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what I did because I didn't use a pattern and my crochet skills aren't good enough to explain it. And I finished the look off with a pair of heels. Thank you for watching as I recreated this doll dress, and I hope you'll join me next week for another handmade happening.